evening. I'm Emily Corio, faculty member with the Reed College of Media. Thank you for coming here tonight. We are just a few minutes away from beginning our panel event this evening. And as you may have noticed, this event is being televised tonight, and it will be broadcast live on West Virginia Public Broadcasting and webcast on West Virginia Public Broadcasting's Facebook page and the College of Media's Facebook page. So with this in mind, we need your help. Please take this moment right now to silence your phones. Also, we would like you to stay in your seat, if at all possible, for the entire event. If you must leave, please do so quietly and in an effort to cause minimal disturbance to the broadcast. Thank you and enjoy the program. We'll begin in just a couple of minutes.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
This program is brought to you by the Ogden Newspaper's Seminar Series, the David C. Hardesty Jr. Festival of Ideas, and West Virginia University Reed College of Media.
West Virginia University presents Patriotism, Politics, and the Playing Field, a panel discussion on the intersection of sports, race, politics, and media. Sports broadcaster Tony Caridi will moderate the discussion after an introduction by College of Media Dean Mary Ann Reed. We joined the event live from the Mountain Lair Ballrooms on the Morgantown campus.
Good evening and welcome to Patriotism, Politics, and the Playing Field. I'm Mary Ann Reed, Dean of the College of Media at West Virginia University. Tonight's panel is presented to you by the WVU College of Media and is sponsored by the David C. Hardesty Festival of Ideas and the Ogden Newspaper Seminar Series. The Festival of Ideas was created in 1995 by President Emeritus David C. Hardesty, Jr. It was inspired by events that he organized as WVU's student body president in the 1960s and is supported by a fund that he and his wife Susan created. Today, the lecture series spans the academic year and brings a diverse group of newsmakers, public figures, and thought leaders, along with WVU's own academic superstars, to engage the campus community in the important issues of the day. And tonight's panel is no exception. Normally, when we talk about sports and athletes, we're talking about what happens on the field, the big plays, the surprise wins, conference rankings, and fan reaction. But lately, there's been a lot of talk about what's happening off the field at the intersection of sports, politics, and culture. From football players kneeling during the national anthem to allegations of sexual abuse in the Me Too era, media coverage of sports these days is often focused on hot-button political issues as much as it is about athletics. But really, this isn't anything new. What happens in the sports world has always reflected the cultural norms and conflicts within our larger society. Think of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in professional baseball, or Muhammad Ali taking a stand against the Vietnam War, or the 1968 Olympics when U.S. medalists Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fists in a Black Power salute. What feels a little different this time is that the mood of the country seems even more divided and partisan, with people on both sides of the aisle passionately defending their positions. Sports journalists and commentators have also spoken out, and like the athletes whose names I just mentioned, these journalists too have paid a price for taking a stand. For example, ESPN's Jamel Hill was suspended and later removed from the anchor desk after calling President Trump a white supremacist on Twitter. Tonight's panel discussion will address the issues of athletes and activism, politics and the playing field, and the media's role in covering sports during difficult and divisive times. This event also helps to kick off our new major in sports and adventure media. Offered with the College of Physical Activity and Sports Sciences, our new major prepares students for careers as journalists and video storytellers, able to cover both team and adventure sports. And what a great way to start our new major with this fantastic lineup of outstanding media professionals who have come here to share their experiences and insights. I'm looking forward to what I know is going to be a very exciting evening and to having the kind of open and respectful dialogue that we celebrate at West Virginia University. But before you meet our panelists, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our moderator. Tony Caridi is a household name in West Virginia. He is the voice of the Mountaineers as the play-by-play announcer for football and basketball. But in one form or another, Tony has been covering WVU sports for nearly 3 decades. Tony joined the West Virginia Radio Corporation in 1984 as a news anchor for WAJR, and he assumed the role of sports director of Metro News 2 years later. He then took over as host of the statewide radio program Sportsline. Now, all of you know Tony is very good at what he does. He's been named the State Sportcaster of the Year many times, and he's a recipient of the West Virginia Broadcasters Association Excellence in Broadcasting Award. He's been broadcast nationally on ESPN and Westwood Radio and regionally for the Big East and Atlantic 10. In addition to his on-air work, Tony oversees the Metro News Internet Division and serves as Special Projects Manager for Pikewood Creative. And in his spare time, he and his wife write children's books. Tony is a native of Lockport, New York, and he is a Syracuse graduate, but we claim him as a true Mountaineer. Ladies and gentlemen, students and faculty, and members of the community, I introduce you to Tony Caridi.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I certainly appreciate it. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you here this evening. We certainly appreciate you guys coming out, and We are certainly delighted to have our panel with us here today. As Marianne just said, we look forward to the conversation that we'll be having for about the next 90 minutes. We'll spend a good chunk of that, about 50 minutes or so, maybe an hour or so, talking amongst the panelists, and then you'll have the opportunity a little bit later on in the program to ask a question. We'll have a microphone out there a little bit later on. So without any further ado, what do you say we meet our panelists? To my immediate left, please welcome Kevin Blackistone, who is a national sports columnist at the Washington Post, a panelist on ESPN's Around the Horn, a contributor to National Public Radio, and an author. As an award-winning sports columnist for the Dallas Morning News, he has covered the most well-known sporting events in the world, including the Summer Olympics, the Super Bowl, Wimbledon, the World Cup, the Tour de France, the British Open, the NBA Finals, the Final Four, College Football Playoff National Championship, NFL playoffs, Major League Baseball playoffs, and World Championship boxing matches. He is currently, in addition to all of that, a professor of the practice at the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism. Please welcome Kevin Blackistone. Next up, please welcome Nancy Armour, an award-winning USA Today sports columnist. After more than 20 years with the Associated Press, she moved on to USA Today in January of 2014. She has covered almost every major sporting event, including every Olympic game since 1996, 5 World Cups, and the end to the Chicago Cubs' 108-year World Series drought. In addition to her long-term in-depth pieces, she writes columns and provides analysis of the big games and events of national interest. Nancy is a graduate of Marquette University with degrees in both journalism and political science. Please welcome Nancy Armour. Next up is Kimberly Martin, who recently joined Yahoo Sports as a senior NFL reporter. Prior to that, she served as the lead beat reporter of the Washington Redskins for the Washington Post. She's also served as a columnist at the Buffalo News, focusing on the Buffalo Bills and the National Football League. Kimberly spent a decade at Newsday, where she worked her way up from covering high school sports and general assignment reporting focused on Major League Baseball, the NFL, and the NBA. Among her writing awards, a first-place finish for project writing by the Associated Press sports editors as part of a team that examined the difficulties former NFL athletes face in transitioning to life after football. Please welcome Kimberly Martin. Next up is Etan Thomas, who played for more than a decade in the National Basketball Association. However, his accomplishments reach far from the court. He is an author, poet, activist, leader, and mentor. Born in Harlem, New York, raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, his latest book, We Matter, Athletes and Activism, was released just this past March. It is a collection of interviews with athletes, activists, media personalities, scholars, and the family of victims of police brutality. Etan was honored for social justice advocacy as the recipient of the 2010 NBA Players Association Community Contribution Award, as well as the 2009 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Foundation Legacy Award. He is a graduate of Syracuse University. In fact, Etan faced West Virginia 4 times during his career with the Orange. And Etan, I did a little research. For the record, he was 3-1 against the Mountaineers and averaged a double-double with 15 points and 10 rebounds. Obviously, poor officiating in those 3 defeats victimized West Virginia. Please welcome Etan Thomas. Keith Reed is a contributing editor for 100 Days in Appalachia, a digital publishing enterprise focused on reframing the narrative of the Appalachia region. He has been a journalist for 17 years, having served as a senior editor at ESPN The Magazine, a staff writer at the Boston Globe, and a contributing writer for Vibe, Essence, Ebony, and numerous other publications. He has also lent commentary on the economy, culture, and sports to CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, NPR, and many other outlets. Please welcome Keith Reed. I should also point out, in addition, he is a past board member of the National Association of Black Journalists and selected there for 3 terms, including serving as the organization's national treasurer. So that's our panelist. What do you say we begin the discussion? We're going to discover and we're going to delve into several different topics, really three main topics, but we will bounce around a little bit. The topics are this: athletes and activism on the playing field. 2, how journalists cover politics and societal issues in sports, and in some cases involve themselves. And lastly, the next collision in the political, cultural issues in sports. Is it related to the Me Too movement or women in sports? We'll get into each of those topics. Our opening question will be the only question in which the panelists will be given the opportunity to answer. Each of them will answer this specific question. Other questions will be one-offs or addressed by a few of our panelists. So the name of this forum is Patriotism, Politics, and the Playing Field. It is a given that they've always been associated in some form. They've always been associated. So guys and ladies, the question to each of you is this: are they inseparable? Are they inseparable? Patriotism, politics, and the playing field, or will they always be merged in some way? Kevin, you can have lead off.
Thank you very much for the invite for this very important topic. I think that, as you just mentioned, politics and sports have always been married together, and I think they always will be married together. And I think it's somewhat troubling when people even suggest that they should be divorced, because I can't think of any other industry, any other corner of society where people are asked to stay away from being involved in our democracy because of what they do for a living. I found it particularly disingenuous when a particular political commentator suggested that LeBron James should keep his mouth shut and just stick to basketball, when in fact this same political commentator had volunteered herself to be the director of a potential political campaign by a guy by the name of Joe the Plumber, who happened to confront President Obama over some issues in which he disagreed with President Obama. So the question really, or the answer to this question really, is that people want their politics separated from sports when it is politics that they don't embrace or that they disagree with.
Very good. Nancy.
Also, thank you for having me here. I think it's a really important conversation to have. I fully agree with what Kevin said. I don't think we can ever divorce sports and politics. Similar to what Dean Reed said, sports has always been the prism through how we view society, which has been a great thing because it's helped us tackle topics that maybe we wouldn't be comfortable having in our living rooms or with our neighbors. But it's easier for us to have these conversations around sports figures who we admire or just know from afar but feel like we know them. What I think has become troubling is that, and it's mostly been on the part of the leagues, is that this idea of forced patriotism, that we have the flyovers, we have these grand gestures involving the flag before a game, and there's nothing wrong with showing pride in your country, but it has become required. I think it was a Major League Soccer commissioner who at one point said, yeah, we might have thought about not doing the anthem because that's not what is done in any other soccer league around the world, but we could never do that in the United States. And to me, that's not what our country is about. So I agree that the idea of sports and politics, we can't separate them, and nor should we, but we have to create some space or some breathing room where people feel free to object or disagree and say it outright that some of these displays, it is meant to, on the surface, it's meant to unify us, but in a lot of ways, what it does is actually stifle dissent because no one feels comfortable saying, do I want to stand, or what happens if a player protests? And those are conversations that we should be having, and we're not.
Thank you. Kimberly.
I'll say you cannot separate sports and politics only because I can't separate being a black woman who happens to cover sports for a living. I think your socioeconomic status, who you are, where you're from, you can't divorce any of that stuff. That is, it's a part of who you are, and it shapes how you see the world, how you move in this world. And the idea of asking whether it's journalists to stick to sports, which was in my mentions a lot of times on Twitter, or asking athletes to shut up and dribble or just focus on sports, it's very dehumanizing. It reduces them to two-dimensional characters that are only here for your particular interests, and I think that's where it gets dangerous.
Well, I definitely agree with everything that everybody just said. Not to be repetitive, I'll say something a little different. I mean, the reason why I wrote my book, We Matter, Athletes and Activism, and interviewed all these different athletes is for the reason that I wanted to encourage the athletes of the future to continue using their voices. I didn't want them to be dissuaded or afraid. So I interviewed athletes of the past to show how, the shut up and dribble thing isn't new. Bill Russell was told to shut up and dribble. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar talks about how he was told to shut up and play. And, all the athletes now are told the exact same thing. Everybody loves, Muhammad Ali now. They build statues of him and, everything like that and put him in museums. But back in his heyday, in the 60s, he was despised. He was like public enemy number one. I mean, he said that he was not going to go to the war. He was hanging out with Malcolm X. He was, talking about society and talking about racism. He was literally, if you think that they was mad at Kaepernick, this is what we're talking about in the 60s. And, and now as time has kind of gone, people have gotten appreciation for, the courage that it took for him to be able to take the stance that he was able to take. And I think in time that same thing will happen to Kaepernick. But I want to encourage athletes from a young age to middle school, high school, college, and professionals to use their voices because there's so much power in it. I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit more. But, athletes and activism and politics and using your voice, no matter what that is, not just the athletes who speak on something that I agree with, but you have the right to be able to speak on something even though if it's something that I don't agree with. You know what I mean? And that's one of the things of valuing somebody's opinion as a human being, not just when they agree with you.
Keith. So for me as a journalist, I've always seen sports as the prism through which you can view almost anything in our society. You can look through the lens of sports and talk about politics. You can look through the lens of sports and talk about economics. You can talk about race. You can talk about all of these things that contextualize how each and every person on that field, how each and every person in an owner's box, how each and every one of us watching at home lives. There's something to be said in almost any sporting event about any one of those things. We may not always be saying those things explicitly. And I think because most of us look at sports as entertainment. When you're watching a game, you want to be entertained, and when you want to be entertained, you're usually trying to check out from some of those things that might be stressors in your life, which may, in fact, be very political things. So people like to check out from those things. And so when you're watching a game, you don't necessarily want to think about them. But the problem is that sports, again, is that lens through which we're kind of casting our gaze back at ourselves. It's a mirror. And so I don't think it's ever going to be possible to completely divorce sports from politics, in that sports touches each and every part of American life. We can't have stadiums in any major city in America without doing a bond issue to pay for that stadium. People vote on whether or not we're going to build those stadiums and whether or not we're going to spend public dollars to do so. There are rules that say that you can't watch a certain sporting event if that sporting event is blacked out, and the FCC permits that. And the FCC is a group of political appointees that's controlled and determined by by which party happens to occupy the Oval Office, right? So like these are real actual things that are affected by real actual political concerns and decisions that each and every one of us makes, whether it's through our voting or where we live and how we spend our tax dollars and what we choose to pay attention to. And it's only when it makes us uncomfortable because we want to entertain and check out, when we want to be entertained and check out, do we say, no, 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 sports is not about politics. Really? How'd it get on your television? It had to be, somebody had to like actually vote that had to happen. How'd you get that stadium? That had to happen. Now it's not political. That's completely impossible in the world that we live in.
Thank you very much. We've already mentioned Colin Kaepernick on several occasions, so why don't we jump right in? Obviously, it has become one of the most controversial, one of the most discussed issues of recent memory in regard to athletes and activism. And I'll open it up to whomever would like to answer first. Where did it go wrong, or did it go wrong?
The way it was packaged. We started out, and I freely admit I was guilty of this initially too, we called them anthem protests.
Yes.
Yes.
Colin Kaepernick was not protesting the national anthem. He was not protesting the military. He was not protesting America. He was using the anthem as a vehicle to protest racial and economic discrimination that results in lost lives. But you say anthem protest and he hates the country, he hates America, he hates whoever you know, fill in the blank. And that narrative carried. And like I said, I was guilty of it initially too, and then I don't know what made me realize that no, these were not anthem protests, they were protests during the national anthem. There is a big difference, words matter, but by that point the narrative had already been carried along, and it's hard to put genies back in bottles, and we've not been able to do it. I think we're doing a better job now. I think most people are recognizing that, you know, public opinion is shifting, that these are not anthem protests, they are protests during the national anthem. But that was the biggest, I think, failure, and it shaped how people viewed these.
Well, I think that was kind of intentionally done. I don't think that was any fault of anybody, or that it just happened by accident. You know, when Colin Kaepernick was explaining everything that happened, he laid out specifically what he was doing and why he was doing it and what it was not. Like, he laid it out specifically. And then, you know, Trump right afterwards kept saying, you know, he's disrespecting our military, he's disrespecting our veterans, he's disrespecting our anthem, you know, and he kind of made it a us against them. So the players that are kneeling are the bad guys, and they're disrespecting our wonderful military, you know, and then that created the division immediately, because you didn't even really hear the topics discussed that Colin Kaepernick expressed that he was specifically taking a knee for. It became something completely different. And I think that was done intentionally because, you know, the best way to be able to get the entire country against someone or a certain segment of the country is to say that this person is against you, against the country. I mean, Colin Kaepernick is the only one who this was done to. It was done to John Carlos and Tommy Smith in the '68 Olympics. So it was done to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. I mean, it's something that has happened, but that's why, you know, I have so much respect for Kaepernick and all the athletes who started taking a knee, from the NFL players to, you saw, high school age athletes taking a knee, but not just taking a knee, but expressing why they were. Expressing to the media, you know, what the reasons were. They were talking about police brutality that was happening in their own town, you know, and the things that they didn't feel that they were represented well in the whole totality of what it was supposed to be, outside of just being valued of being an athlete. And I think that's the part where, you know, as journalists, we have to be able to capture that story more than the polarizing one that just says the national anthem protest.
I think there's something that's missed, and I would throw the question back out and say, where did Colin Kaepernick go, where did that story go right? Because we continue to discuss what Colin Kaepernick did and the response to what Colin Kaepernick did publicly as though it's some sort of a transgression. But because of what Colin Kaepernick did, let's start with the fact that what he did was a silent protest. It wasn't just a protest. He didn't go out and try to organize mass numbers of NFL players or athletes.
And it was suggested that he kneel.
And it was suggested that he kneel. He
By
sat
a veteran.
silently by himself off to the side while everyone else was standing. And then someone came to him and said, no, that's not the way you should do it. You should kneel out of respect for the flag and out of respect for veterans. And he did so. He didn't ask anybody else to pay attention, but because of what he did, the entire country paid attention. And they paid attention to what his detractors had to say about him, but they also started to pay attention to what he had to say. And they started paying attention to what the hundreds of other athletes in the NFL and outside the NFL had to say. Because of what he did, the NFL has put up a good deal of money for community service projects around the country. Colin Kaepernick still doesn't have a job, but was the NFL really spending money on social justice issues before Colin Kaepernick kneeled? Was that on anybody's radar in any one of at the owners' meetings? I don't think it was. I can tell you it was not. Because of what he did, there's now this campaign. There are literally companies, like Colin Kaepernick's commercial with Nike that came out this season, where it was reported Nike had actually thought about dropping him, and now Nike is supporting him, gave him a new deal, came out with a campaign that's now encouraging other people to tell their stories. So I don't think that this is really a story about something going wrong. I think that the dialogue has been so contentious because we live in this contentious moment in society where everything has to be us versus them. But if you kind of stand back from the us versus them talking heads screaming on television, and I've been one of those guys talking about this very thing on TV, but if we step back from that and just say, like, what's happened since the first time that guy took a knee on the sideline by himself, and where this discussion over social justice in the country has gone because of what he did, I think he was kind of successful, probably beyond his own wildest imagination.
Kevin, give me your take on this, because I know you have a thought in regard to Kaepernick and in addition to the Nike campaign.
Well, sure. So I think there are two issues here. One is Colin Kaepernick's methodology, and the other is the result of his methodology. And so I agree with everyone here that Colin Kaepernick's protest has been successful. We pay attention in the media and in the public to issues of police lethality against unarmed black men in this country more so than ever before. I think that there have been police officers who have been dragged into the judicial system rightly, and in some instances convicted, who years ago may well have almost assuredly would have escaped the judicial system. Unfortunately, when we look at the Washington Post database on police, on extrajudicial killings by police in this country, the numbers have not necessarily gone down. So this is an issue that we still struggle with. And Eitan and I have discussed the Colin Kaepernick's methodology before, and where I think his method may have gone wrong, and I think he has alluded to this through other people because he hasn't spoken about it himself, is that his silence after he first spoke allowed those of us in the media to interpret it in a number of different ways, and allowed politicians in this country to fill in that silence with their own attacks on him or what he stood for, and have often muddled the message. And I, for one, have not embraced Colin Kaepernick's Nike ad, because the Nike ad to me doesn't reflect anything about why Colin Kaepernick is in a museum why he is being revered in so many circles, because the ad didn't say anything about police lethality. It didn't say anything about social justice. It seemed to me that he allowed Nike to co-opt his message. Now, on the other side, I assume that he's taking the income from that ad and using it on his Know Your Rights campaign and all the work that he's doing with youth. And I hate to tell someone else how to protest their protests, but you know, I think of the Muhammad Ali interview called "Damn Some Money," where he talked about the importance of his message over the importance of being paid to go back and box or paid to do something, and not focus on why he refused to go to the Vietnam War.
And this is where we've had a conversation about this in
Yes, we have.
another panel. So we have different views about both of the topics. So my view, as far as Colin Kaepernick making his statement, I feel that he laid out specifically why he was doing it. I don't think he needed to say anything else. You know, different journalists wanted him to say something exclusively to them, or, you know, repeat it over and over again 20 times, but I didn't feel that he needed to repeat it 20 times, because he said it the first time. You can go back to the tape and you could just, everybody do their stories specifically from the tape of why he said he was doing this. So that was the part where we had a different of opinion. But as far as Nike, I think that people give Nike a little bit too much props for what they did. On one hand, I understand why, because the entire, you know, if you turned on Fox News, it was almost like they were reveling, just happy that no team was picking them up. You know what I mean? Kind of to show that if you do protest, this will happen to you. And it's like the NFL was almost kind of using that as a way to deter future athlete activists in the NFL from ever saying anything, because then you too would be Kaepernicked. So I think that Nike kind of rescued and took that narrative away to say, you know, yeah, he's okay. And from young people, you know, going to different high schools and going to different colleges, they say, oh, you know what I mean, that he didn't get punished the way that everybody thought that he would. And so that part, I understand why people celebrate Nike. But let's not be under any kind of, you know, false view of why Nike did it. You know, they looked at their demographic and they picked a side. So they said, okay, their demographic is not the Make America Great Again crowd. You know, those are not the people who are waiting for the LeBrons to come out and, you know, buying the Nike hoodies that are coming out and everything like that and buying the Nike apparel. So that's not their demographic. Their demographic is more this side. And that's the side that they chose. So it was really a little bit more of an economic decision. It's a business decision. You know what I mean? And any of the other companies would have loved to do what Nike did, because then they would have had those people who were going to start buying their product more because they associate with Colin Kaepernick, and that is the demographic. Not to say that it's still not, you know, I understand why people want to applaud Nike, but don't forget that they are a business. They don't really, I don't want to say they don't really care, you know what I mean, about I think whatever that topic was, if that was the demographic, I think they would have chosen that topic.
Right. One more line on this, and then we'll head off here. You mentioned that people detested Muhammad Ali when he was in the midst of his protest, and Bill Russell heard it, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar heard it, right? And let's face it, Colin Kaepernick has become a martyr. His career, to this point, is over. Will that, and I'll offer this to any of you out here, will that in the future keep people away from becoming athlete activists? Or is it a given that maybe Kaepernick will open up an opportunity for even more conversation?
I think it can be both. I think it might actually depend on the sport a little bit. I cover the NFL, and I've had numerous conversations. I've been in a lot of locker rooms, a lot of guys that I know feel, head coaches even, who feel a certain way, but keep it to themselves because, yeah, Kimberly, it's not really worth it, you know, or when I'm done playing, then I'll talk. And it's sort of like, well, then you won't have a platform when you're done playing. Where I think that the freedom, I don't see NFL players expressing a lot of their views prior to Kaepernick. I know of so many who have so much to say, but they feel like the cost is too great. And I don't see that. I see NBA players just...
I think one of the big differences is that NFL contracts are not guaranteed. So if you get out of line, a team can cut you and your salary's gone. Whereas an NBA player, he's got some protection because his contract is going to be paid whether he's hurt, whether he's, taken off management, whatever. And I think it's also no secret or not a surprise then that most of the NFL players that we have seen protest and be outspoken are veterans. I've talked to a lot of people in the Players Coalition that they do have younger players involved, but they are not out in front because they know it's a risk to them. So if you see the guys who are out in front, Anquan Boldin is retired. Malcolm Jenkins is a veteran with the Super Bowl ring. Demario Davis is a veteran. So these guys have some, I don't want to say credibility, but they've proven themselves or they've made themselves valuable in a way that a team cannot just cut them just because. And I think that's where one of the biggest differences is.
And I would also say that, as everyone alluded, we often talk about sports being a mirror of society. And we have to remember that, in the developed world, the United States, those of us in this room, are among the least politically active people in that designation. People on college campuses have the lowest voting rates of anyone, in part because you don't have the experience of doing it, but in part because you're in this country. And I'm sure that, if I ask people in this audience to raise your hand about how many people have been politically active, how many people have been to a demonstration for anything in the past year, how many people have marched on this campus about something, how many people are part of a political organization that's standing for something, most of you would not raise your hands. So in a lot of ways, athletes are inculcated as American citizens. And none of us are active enough, and many of us are not active enough because we're concerned about how that might reflect on us in our communities, how it might reflect on us in our jobs, how it might reflect on you as a college student in terms of a job that you may want to get. So you become conscious about your social media footprint when it comes to making political statements. You become concerned about whether or not you were seen at a rally on your campus and maybe some faculty member who you hope would vouch for you in some employment down the line might see you and then think otherwise about you. So we're all in the same boat.
I think to your point about the difference in the NBA and the NFL, I interviewed the commissioner of the NBA for my book, Adam Silver, and I asked him, would he punish someone for having an opinion, speaking out on, and I always add a caveat, if it's something that you don't agree with. And I interviewed Mark Cuban, CEO of the Mavericks, and I interviewed Steve Kerr, and I interviewed I interviewed some different people in management positions, and I wanted to do the same thing in NFL. Roger Goodell didn't return my call, and I wanted to interview Dan Snyder, Washington football team, because my whole goal.
Stopped you. I would have told you.
The thing is though, they didn't respond to me, so I didn't get their interview. But I wanted to do Jerry Jones as well. But I wanted to be able to interview them to see, because I wanted to encourage younger athletes to use their voices. That's the whole one of the main reasons why I wanted to show all these different athletes using their voices and these people in these management positions saying that they would not punish you if you used your voice. And I only got that on the NBA side, and I wanted to get on the NFL side. I got NFL players to be able to say that, but not the management. So, and their players were players that were established, like you said, Anquan Boldin, Michael Bennett. They were the outliers who were speaking out, and that's kind of the issue.
I was going to say, but like you said about Nike, let's not give your former employer of the NBA too much credit, because before Colin Kaepernick, there were the women at the Minnesota Lynx, and the NBA's reaction to the women at the Minnesota Lynx, who stood up to protest the extrajudicial killing of Philando Castile was to punish those women for standing up. And it wasn't until public pressure came back that they reversed course, rescinded the fines, and respected those women. So I'm cautious about giving the NBA credit as some sort of vanguard for social change when it comes to sports in this country.
Well,
I also
just respond right to him. Said Adam Silver is different than David Stern, so I think that you would see a whole different reaction if David Stern was still in office. I think there's a big difference, and I think that the WNBA reacted because the entire WNBA together stood together. That's something that we haven't seen, and I don't think enough gets talked about that. You know, I mean, after Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed, the Minnesota Lynx, they were the first one. They wore the shirts that said, you know, Philando Castile, because that happened in Minnesota. And then they said the Dallas 5 and Black Lives Matter. And then, like you said, the president of the WNBA said, okay, don't do that anymore, or everybody will get fined. And some of the police in Minnesota actually turned away and left their posts and said, okay, because what you did, we're not going to even, secure the area. And so it was like a big deal. And then after they said that, it was like it ignited the entire WNBA. Then you just had the New York Liberty, and you had the Indian Fever, and everybody did it together. And then as an entire league, and I interviewed Swing Cash and Tamika Catchings because I asked them, how did y'all do that? You know what I mean? We haven't seen that in the NFL. You ain't seen that in the NBA where everybody together. I mean, they had foreign players that ain't even from here. You know what I mean? Don't even know what's going on. But they were standing with them wearing Black Lives Matter shirts, wearing things like that. And I was like, well, how did y'all do that? And then, Swing Cash said, well, first of all, women just do it differently. You know what I mean? And honestly, a lot of the players saw that we were hurting. It was like a real, solemn time after everything that happened. And they asked us what was wrong. We explained to them, and then they stood with us. So if the NFL did that, they would force their hands. Everybody, because Kaepernick, let's be honest, Kaepernick was kind of out there by himself for a little bit. You know what I mean? Nobody really support him at first. Then after a while, some more people. But imagine if the entire league, like if they did like what the WNBA did, they would force their hands. So no matter what they thought, they would force them to go along with it.
Let me ask you this. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Nancy. Go ahead.
I also think it's different who your standard bearer is. In the NBA, it's LeBron James, who, Chris Paul, Dwayne Wade. These are the biggest stars that the league has. If Kaepernick had started the protest in the Super Bowl season, I think there would have been probably a different reaction. Maybe not much different, but I think it would have been a different reaction because he is a superstar. When he started the protests, he was coming back from an injury. He wasn't, he is one of the NFL's best quarterbacks, but he wasn't the number one or number, yeah, exactly. And I think that makes a big difference. If you have those people starting the conversation and saying this is not okay, that's going to make it really hard for your league, to come down on you. And it also, it draws more attention because they have star power behind them.
In essence, you're saying that the totality of an organization, in this case the WNBA, can really generate some power. Let's bring it down to the college level. Here we are. What if is the scenario? Collegiate athletes banded together on a societal issue. Do you see it percolating? And Atan, I'll ask you, do you see it percolating, and would it be impactful?
Well, it happened. The Missouri football team, they had gone through on campus where all these different racial incidents was going on. All the student body was trying to get the president to pay attention to these racial incidents. Nothing was happening. You know what I mean? They were frustrated all this time. They felt like they didn't even take them seriously. No meeting with them or anything like that. And then they connected with the football team. And the football team threatened. It was like, okay, so say it was, I don't know if this was the exact day, but say it was on a Monday. The football team said, okay, we're going to threaten to boycott the game Saturday, right? So they had been trying to do this the entire year of trying to get this president to be able to address these different racial incidents that was going on. And so they said that on a Monday. By Wednesday, he went up against the board for review, and then by Thursday, he was fired. I was like, wow. You know what I mean? Like, that was quick, but that just shows you the power that athletes have, even at a collegiate level. Because, again, you know, they started to show what the university stood to lose if they actually did boycott that game. And, you know, of course, everything comes down to economics. And that's how it is in everything, though. Economics is the thing that pushes. If, you know, in D.C., you know, they've been pushing to try to get the Washington football team to change the name, right? The only reason why it hasn't changed is because sponsors haven't pulled out. Sponsors pulled out and said, we're not going to support this until this name is changed. The name will be changed like that. You know what I mean? You're talking about with Donald Sterling in L.A. You know what I mean? He had been a racist for a long time. He was, and this isn't just, you know, saying it. He owns the record for the discrimination lawsuits being paid in Los Angeles history. You know what I mean? And that was for 10, 15 years ago. So they've known who he was. But after those tapes came out, then you started seeing sponsors pull out. And then you saw, then the NBA players pressured everything, we want something out. And then you saw something change. Everything ties down to economics. And I think that's where athletes really have to understand the power that they have and how whatever it is that at the collegiate level or the professional level, how much economic power they actually have and how that is what can move the needle.
So on that note, I want to talk about a little bit. I'm not sure if it's still on. So on that note, I want to talk about a little bit how sports again is a mirror for society. When you talk about the women in WNBA being the ones who banded together more quickly to to pressure the ownership to make changes, and when the students at Missouri banded together to do that, right? And how these changes generally happen because of economics. These changes are sort of shaped by how things work economically. Is it not true that in the history of this country that most social protest movements, most successful social protest movements have generally been formed organically by people at the bottom of the economic ladder? Who in professional sports in the United States makes less on average than WNBA players? I mean, the guys in the NBA have these guys are worried about contracts, in many cases guaranteed contracts. In the NFL, they don't have guaranteed contracts, but these are still multimillionaire players. They're worried about whether or not they're going to eat next week. Not literally, but they're worried about whether or not they're going to actually take home that game check from week to week, which in some instances can be, you know, $500,000, $600,000, $800,000 a year per week for one game check. They're worried about losing that kind of money. The WNBA, they're not making that kind of money. They're not. They're not. And it's a travesty. We could have a whole other discussion about pay for women professional athletes and condition that women professional athletes work under. But the reality is that in terms of economics for labor in sports in the United States, women are at the bottom. Who came together to force a change en masse and in a unified way? It was the women who were at the bottom. That's not a coincidence. And it also wasn't a coincidence that student athletes who universally, no matter what their experience, what their background, what their race and ethnicity, where they come from, what region, they don't get paid. They get scholarships, but they don't get paid. Coaches are getting paid millions. Universities are, you know, conferences have enormous television deals, right? The athletes are the ones out there on the field. They're not getting paid. Who came together as a team to say, we ain't playing that game? Are you crazy? You want me to go out on that field over there on Saturday and make you a couple more $1 million? And you won't even have a conversation with the students? And I'm the only one not getting paid? Nah, we're not doing that. So there's an economic part of this, right? That sort of mimics what happens in the broader society again, where it's poor or relatively poor or underpaid or unpaid labor working class that recognizes the injustices before they afflict and affect the wealthier and the more comfortable. And those are the people who you're going to see make those changes and who are going to be willing to take those risks because they view it as, what am I losing? You're already not paying me the way the guys get paid. You're already not paying me the way the coaches are getting paid. We're gonna do this, and we're gonna take the only way that we have to be able to take back some power is to threaten to take away your economic power.
Yeah, and that opens up an entirely different conversation for a different panel, but we could go on a long time on that. Topic number 2, let's jump into this one. How journalists cover politics and issues in society, in sports, and in some cases involve themselves. What is the appropriate way for a journalist to share his or her political view?
Still working on that. Still working on
Work in progress?
It's a difficult topic. As you mentioned earlier with Jamel at ESPN, you know, gets into, well, she said it on Twitter. She's a media personality. This is why ESPN hired her, for her to be a voice, to use her platform. Now she is a personality. She's using that platform, and now we don't like what she says. I think it's hard. I think the lines have always been blurred, and I think now it's difficult to talk about and write about sports and not discuss politics when you have the president, you know, getting involved in talking about sports and players and insulting players and players responding. I don't know what the right answer is, because I found that it's funny, when I was a beat writer, you know, my job was not to have an opinion. It was sort of, you write what you write about what happened in the game, what the score was, On Twitter, I showed some personality, but I didn't get all up in, you know, the election, Hillary versus Trump. You know, I didn't tweet a lot about it. And now I'm in this lane of, you know, I'm a black woman, and I can't separate it. And I think there is a space for, you know, I don't tweet anything negative about any political party or anything like that, but I tweet articles that have to, that resonate with me as a person of color, as a woman. And I think what bothers me about journalists now, I don't see enough reporters who want to understand the subjects that they cover, understand their point of view. And I don't know how you can do the job of covering athletes when you don't want to take the time to understand these athletes. Yes, you cover sports. You're supposed to cover the Super Bowl. You cover playoff games. You cover, you know, that baseball game on a random Wednesday night. Yes, but this whole league is made up of individuals, and if you don't take the time to understand perspectives that are different than yours, how exactly are you filtering their opinion, their thoughts to the fans that root for them? And I think I've kind of, I don't know, I've kind of come to a point where I think recognizing that we talk about athletes having a platform, I think journalists do too, and understanding how to use it without making yourself a political pundit, but also talking about things that resonate with you and impact your life.
I think a lot of it has to do with, and you alluded to this, the job that you have. When I worked for the Associated Press, you didn't weigh in on anything with any kind of an opinion. If you did, you got a note from the boss. And that is still, you know, we've got ethics standards at USA Today too, but in my role as a columnist, I know
office, and next thing you know, you Andrew Gillum's spokesperson, which is what he's doing right now. My inspiration in journalism is through advocacy and through pamphleting. So Thomas Paine, David Walker, Ida B. Wells. And so my first job in college, and shortly after I got out of college, was with a newsletter in Chicago called the Chicago Reporter, which focused on social and racial issues in the city of Chicago. So I believe in advocacy journalism, and as Nancy just alluded, once someone gave me a column, it was over. I'm not concerned with hiding my point of view. Everything I write, I try to write with a purpose, and I'm writing with something in mind, and I'm trying to, if not change your mind, at least get you to think about a particular issue in a different way. And I think that's fine. I think we have a long history in this country, and it has kind of come full circle, where the state of mind of a journalist, the place where they come from, as Kimberly said, a black woman, makes a big difference. And if you go back and read the Kerner Commission report, which I advise everyone to read, from the 1960s, which was an analysis of why we had urban rebellions in the 1960s. The one industry that was pointed out for being at fault was the media, because it wasn't diverse, because it was mostly white males, and because of that, they ignored these very important tremors that were taking place in communities of color and in communities of poor people. And those voices needed to be heard. And so if it's not for me, Keith, or Kimberly being involved in media, or someone with an open mind like Nancy, it's a very good chance those voices are not heard. And so advocacy can be done well within journalism, and it's important.
But remember that, and I definitely agree with everything that you all said, but remember, it's also important to point out that there are factions of the media who genuinely do not want to hear an athlete say anything outside of their sport. And that's kind of what I came up against a lot my time in the NBA. Of course, I had other journalists who respected what I said and, you know, valued my opinion. But then I had other journalists who really did not like that I had an opinion. And it's that type of thing where somebody has the power of the pen. They have the ability to kind of cast you in any way that they want to. See, we didn't have social media when I was playing. Like, so now athletes can kind of say their own thing and let you know specifically where they stand on something. You know, I remember when I was playing with the Washington Wizards and the invasion of Iraq just happened, and I wanted to come out and I wanted to speak about the war in Iraq because I was very much against it. You know, I was speaking at different rallies around DC and things like that, and I wanted to speak against it. And I went to a Washington Post beat writer. He said, "No, I can't do that." I was like, "Really?" I went to Washington Times guy, and he said, "No, I'm not going to touch that at all." And I was like, y'all literally follow us around after every practice, after every shoot around, trying to get us to tell you something so you could do a story. And now that I want to do something, you don't want to touch it. So a different reporter wrote about it, and then a lot of reporters saw it and started talking about it then. And I remember, you know, some reporters in particular, you know, really didn't like what I had to say and really was telling me that I had no right to be able to speak on that topic. So when a reporter feels that way about an athlete, their entire coverage of that athlete changes. It shifts. You know what I mean? Because now they feel that you stepped outside of your lane. You know what I mean? This is not an area that you're supposed to be in. And you know, that's not a new thing. Like I said before, Bill Russell heard it, Kareem heard it, but that's a part where we need reporters who will be able to represent when an athlete does use his voice and does be able to speak out, because there's going to be the other ones, the naysayers, that want to tear him down and tell him that he has no right to speak. So we need reporters like y'all.
Yeah, very interesting.
I'd like to think that that would be different now, because I think we have recognized, at least most of the reporters I talk with, we have recognized that it's important to hear who you guys are as people, not because you're athletes, but because you have a different perspective. We all come at things from different perspectives. You mentioned you're a black woman. I'm a white woman. I went to a Catholic college. I mean, there are all kinds of things that shape your worldviews and your perspectives, and it's important that we recognize that and try and understand that. So I would hope now that we've come, I don't want to say it's you know, completely fine, but I would hope that media would be more receptive to it now, because I think there is a recognition that everybody has something to add to the conversation.
Honestly, it's just certain media. Do you know what I mean? Wow. So nobody on Fox News was like, Laura Ingraham doesn't feel that way.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that certain media, Jason Whitlock doesn't feel that way. You know, and he's a black man. And, you know, so there's media who really genuinely do not want to hear an athlete say anything outside of the sport. And that's why I always reiterate, and I always give y'all props when I see y'all, taking the athlete's side as far as their right to be able to speak. Not necessarily saying that you agree with everything they're saying, but just that they have the right to say it. That's all.
Okay, can I just throw this out here, because this is one thing we haven't kind of talked about. This is the thing that just bugs the heck out of me.
You are on live TV.
Go
right ahead, yes.
Why is your opinion any less valuable than the President of the United States? Or John Elway, who wrote a letter on his Bronco stationery supporting the nomination of Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court? Or Kevin Bidwell, who is the owner of the Arizona Cardinals, who not only sent a letter or signed his name to a letter supporting Brett Kavanaugh's nomination, he used the team's social media platforms to promote it. So why is it okay for people like that to inject politics into sports, and it's not okay for a player?
Because athletes don't matter to a lot of people. That's is stupid. The crux of it all.
But that's reality, though, and then especially if you tie in black athletes. So black athletes are supposed to stay in a certain place. That's the nature of it. I heard stay in your place so many different times. You know what I mean? And you are outside of your lane. You need to stay and be thankful and be grateful. And then you become the ungrateful. Even when you hear some of the criticism of Kaepernick, they're like, who is he to complain about anything? He should just be grateful.
That he has, the contract, these athletes, these $1 million athletes and stuff like that.
The number of times that you will hear criticism of a black athlete, and in literally the next phrase, the next clause in that sentence is how much money they made. That Colin Kaepernick with his $40 million contract has no right, and it's like, wait, well, what does that? I'm sorry, I was not aware that how much money anyone made had anything to do with their right to say something in a democracy. And to add to your point, we never say that, that team owner, comma, a billionaire, comma, we really can't stand it. And it's Bill Rhoden, the famed New York Times columnist, wrote a book. It's what that book's. Bill's book has got to be 15 years old, maybe 20 years old by now, called $40 Million Slaves, and it is in the title of the book says it all. It is about the contextualizing athletes, primarily African American athletes, who are being used as labor in a system that overwhelmingly enriches almost entirely older white males who own the teams. And the reason why he called it $40 million slaves, he talked about this idea that, we look at athletes as being spoiled because they make so much money, and so now you make so much money, so you should be grateful that you make so much money, and therefore you forfeit your right to have anything to say about anything else. But really what that is it just simply mimics a very, very old system in the United States that's been replicated over and over and over again, where black labor or woman labor or poor labor has been, once you make a slight advance, just a slight advance, I make a little bit more money now. Well, now you've got the right to vote. What are you complaining about? You got the right to go into the workplace. What are you complaining about? You got Roe v. Wade. What are you complaining about? Why are you upset? Well, we're upset because it took us 275 years to get to so it might have something to do with the centuries that it took us to get to that point. It might also have something to do with the fact that the same people who are telling us, who are telling you, who are telling Colin Kaepernick, who are telling Serena Williams that they should be satisfied with because they've become individually wealthy, that erases the need to speak about social justice for people who come from the same exact circumstances that they came from, and that they are not that far from. I mean, the distance between being a millionaire athlete and being poor and disenfranchised for many of these athletes is like one generation, or maybe even just a couple of years. Like a few years ago, I was, 5 years ago, I was a poor high school senior in a family that could barely afford to pay its rent, and today I have some money, and there's just not that much distance between the kid who got shot in the same community that I came from and where I am now, even though I make $5 million a year. Like, does that really change who I am and why I should care about that? So it's very important that we, again, examine these kind of contextual links between what the athletes are saying and what's happening in sports, and what and how we view them, because it's just super important to recognize that.
And also, though, that, and this is just a reality, a lot of people think that athletes are in this protective bubble, that athletes don't have to deal with the same thing in society that everybody else has to deal with. And that's one thing that I've heard a lot. So in interviewing a lot of the athletes, they're surprised to hear that athletes have to deal with police brutality. The athletes have to have the talk with our children every time somebody gets murdered by the police and they're unarmed and nothing happened. What athletes then in turn have the discussions with their children. Do you know what I mean? And that's one of the biggest reactions that I got from my book, was just saying, like, wow, I never would have thought that D. Wade thought of his sons the way that, you know, I mean, it's amazing, but that's the reality of how people think. So the reason why when you hear a lot of the times when people say, okay, we understand that you want to protest, we understand that you want to talk about police brutality, just do it on your own time. And go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, and the reason why you can't do it on your own time, for one, the whole purpose of protesting is to do it at a time when everybody would see. If you do it on your own time, nobody would see it. That makes no sense. But also, though, the thing about it is, you know, you see the athlete on the field or on the court, and they're performing, right? But after that game is over, they're still black. So you have athletes talking about being stopped by the police on the way back from a game that when they had an entire crowd cheering their name, when they made the big touchdown. So they're driving home and they're being stopped by the police. You know what I mean? Because they're driving a nice car, because they're in a certain neighborhood, because they fit the subscription, you know what I mean? The description. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I interviewed Thabo Sefolosha, and if you don't remember who Thabo Sefolosha is, then the NYPD actually broke his leg. Mm-hmm. All this stuff happening in a crowd, and they look at him, and he's the one who they look at as the threat. You know, James Blake, the tennis player. I mean, I interviewed him, and he's talking about he's sitting there waiting to go to the U.S. Open outside his hotel in broad daylight. And the police come in and rush him, tackle him to the ground, handcuff him, because they thought that he looked like somebody who... And so those are the things that you hear athletes talk about, and it's like mainstream America is so surprised. And I hear, you know, like people like Bill O'Reilly, who they say, you know, well, when I get stopped by the police, I just give them my information and follow the commands and everything is all right. And I'm like, Bill, your experience isn't the same as my experience when I get stopped by the police. It's completely different. But hearing an athlete talk about that makes it resonate differently with mainstream America. So it's like bringing an actual regular grief, regular experience that everyday black people have to deal with and have been talking about, but hearing Michael Bennett say it, and Dwayne Wade say it, and Russell Westbrook say it, it just resonates differently.
At this point, thank you. All good points. So you've heard their perspectives. Now it's your opportunity to ask questions. And as I said earlier on, if you do have a question, we're going to ask you to come into the middle here of the floor, and Miss Gina will have the magic microphone, and you can direct your questions. The rules are quite simple. Just, if you would, state your question, give us your first name, state your question, and we will hear from the panel. So if you've got a question, you can kind of form a line coming up, and there's Gina right there, unless they have left you speechless. Well, you guys line up, and you go ahead if anyone would like to come up. Let me ask you a question. We started that off about Jemele Hill. Was she treated fairly? How should she have been treated?
In which instance?
The white supremacist instance.
Was she treated fairly? I have seen. Let me preface this with that's and probably this is probably the case for almost everyone up here. She's a personal friend, and I've spoken to her about this. Jemele would say, if she were sitting in this chair, that she did not take issue with the suspension. She didn't fight it. She may not necessarily have personally agreed with it or you know, but she didn't take an issue with the suspension. Okay, so just on that basis, like, if she has a dispute with her employer, which was also my former employer, and she's not taking issue with it, then I don't think that it's appropriate for me to say, well, no, she wasn't treated fairly. But then there's this other thing that happens in context, and I shared with some of the students here on campus earlier, an incident that happened when I was on a network talking about what happened to Jamel, and I was on with another panelist who made reference to part of the female anatomy within 45 seconds of starting a discussion about a woman in a segment that was also being hosted by another woman. And so when you talk about, is she being treated fairly and has she been treated fairly in that context, it's absolutely not. I think that, you know, with all due respect to my panelists up here, I think they would probably tell you that women in this industry face a tremendous number of challenges in terms of things that the liberties that people take with insulting them, with insulting their intelligence, with talking about their appearance, with questioning their qualifications. And that has happened over and over and over and over and over again to Jamel and any number of women colleagues that I've had in this business. And to say that that is not fair is to put it extraordinarily mildly. It's pretty despicable when we see that type of thing happening.
Thanks, Keith. Questions from the crowd. If you would, your first name and your question, please.
Yeah, I got with a mic. Well, guys, thanks for coming. My name is Terrell Adams, former Mountaineer and currently working at Wake Forest in the athletic community. Myself and probably everyone here really appreciate you all coming out today and just talking about the matter today. From my perspective, you know, just watching you guys on TV, it's one thing, you know, for us to have conversations talking about athletes not being able to speak up, or even journalists growing up to trying to speak up on politics. You know, from our perspective, you know, it seems like the media doesn't really care, so it's really refreshing to see you guys show your opinion towards all of this. So we were talking a lot of ideas and conversations on what we should do or what athletes should do speaking up. And from what I got from all of this is that, you know, athletes has a great opportunity of bonding together, to really come together and help each other out whenever an issue comes up, because as you say, it really does come to economics, but once they all come together, they can really make an issue happen very fast. But on the journalism end, you know, it's a very competitive market and everyone's coming for everybody's job. So when you want to come and speak up on politics, like, what is kind of your idea or solution on, you know, being able to speak up and use your voice and on your platform?
Okay. So personally, I've never been afraid to challenge employers. And I think that anybody, look, when you protest something, when you challenge your employer, when you challenge any individual who's in power or any power structure, you are taking a risk. Whether you're an athlete, a journalist, a union leader, like, it's a risk. And so to the first part of what you said, like, what can athletes do or student athletes do? You've got to look at the facts on the ground, look at what it means for you, and you're going to have to make a decision about whether the risk that you're taking is worth it to you, right? So for me, in newsrooms, I remember working in Boston. I was at the Boston Globe, working in that newsroom, and there was at that time we called it the 14-1 shutout, or 14-0 shutout, meaning over a finite period of time, I think it was maybe a year, maybe a little bit more than a year, there had been 14 hires in the newsroom, and not one was a person of color. This was in Boston, Massachusetts, which today is a majority non-white city. Okay, and so how can you begin to? We talked about the difference in how sports or how any subject is covered. How can you then cover that kind of a city with all of these people in it, right, without having any sort of diversity in your newsroom? So we challenged our management team, we challenged our editor, we challenged our publisher to do better. We asked for Go ahead.
What was your direction of challenging your editor? Like, what was the best way you
There were a number of ways. We started with writing a letter that was signed on to by numerous members of the staff, not every member of the staff, but numerous members of the staff. We asked for a meeting with the editor of the paper and his management team. We asked for a meeting with the publisher of the paper and his management team. And through those meetings and consistent dialogue, there was some change there. Did it make the situation perfect? No. And did it make it uncomfortable for some of us? Yes. It'd be disingenuous to say that any of us felt that we were targeted. I mean, to their credit, management heard our concerns and didn't retaliate. But it's not going to be like that in every setting. In every setting, you won't have receptive management when you go. You won't have always a receptive ownership group in sports. You won't always have receptive, political or economic power structure, right? Like, you are challenging power. That's what you're doing. And when you challenge power, there tends to be some sort of reverberation or repercussion, and you just have to make a decision about whether or not you want to do that. The reason I served 3 terms on the board of directors of the National Association of Black Journalists is because that organization has been at the forefront and at the vanguard of addressing what Ken Blackstone talked about earlier, which was referred to in the Kerner Commission report, that we did not have newsrooms in this country that were capable of reflecting what was happening in American communities to the extent that they had done a disservice to the country leading up to mass rebellion. And that reverberated throughout society. That kind of power that limits opportunity and makes it impossible to be able to do the real job of what journalists are supposed to do, that kind of power has to be challenged. But I can tell you that in that organization, I know numerous people who lost jobs. I know numerous people who were targeted. I have seen and heard complaints from people who felt that things that happened to them when they spoke up were retaliatory. This is real life. This happens. At some point, you have to make a decision about what risk is worth taking, and if you decide that it's a risk worth taking, then you take it and you deal with what happens afterwards.
Thank you. Time is running short. Can we have our next question, please?
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Myers, and my question is, in today's world, it's really hard to be a journalist at times, so why do you stick with it?
There's a good question.
It's important. There's no greater commodity on the planet Earth than information. And it is those of us who collect it and disseminate it who make it happen. I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel like I was called to this. I knew this is what I wanted to do when I was in high school, and I've never done anything else. But I think it's important. I think it's important to democracy. I think it's important to freedom. To me, it's the most important job that there is. So why do I do it? Those are the reasons why.
I think you just love it. You love being able to, there's power in being able to tell other people, at least for me, to tell other people's stories, and that other people trust you to sort of filter their thoughts, their words, and to present it in a way that people who may not be the same race, gender, ethnicity, root for that team, but it still resonates with them. Like, that's really powerful to be able to do that.
Thank you very much.
I'm Quinn Kuski, and Nancy, at one point during the panel you said that Colin Kaepernick was one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL when he was kind of removed from the league. But if you look at his stats over his last 2 years, he was, for a QBR, he had like a 50 QBR. It was out of 35 quarterbacks that had played at least 10 games in that year. In that 2-year span, he was ranked 31st. And I was wondering if for anybody on the panel, if you genuinely believe, if a quarterback, say, if Patrick Mahomes was to start kneeling during the national anthem now, someone who is quickly becoming a superstar in the league, do you think he would be blackballed by the NFL as they say Kaepernick is?
Absolutely not. He's too valuable to his team. And I get that argument a lot about Colin. And first of all, the 49ers were and still are not a good team.
Horrible.
Yeah, thank you. You said it much nicer than I would have.
Watch that
but
game the other night.
That reflects, I mean, his stats are a reflection of his team. But you also go back and look at his interception ratio, and that tells you that he's a pretty decent quarterback. I think he's got of active quarterbacks, I think he's second only to Rodgers. So, pretty good company.
Thank you very much.
Okay, my name is Tadini Manuenyika. So before I ask my question, I will say I'm an international student, and I'm asking these questions because I just want to understand the nation. So the first question that I want to ask is, do you think that if it was maybe a white person who was doing the same protest, the media, they would have gotten the same backlash as
No.
what happened? Okay, great. Then the second, the second question would be, since you are in media, do you think that the nation is trying to keep certain issues quiet or trying to rush through certain issues that have been caused because of your history, but is trying to rush through them? So they try to hush people not to talk about certain things? Yeah, those are my two questions.
So wait a second. Good questions. Let me ask you something. You guys instantly said absolutely no if someone was white if they protested. Is that in unison? Yes.
I would have loved to see J.J. Watt, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, one of them kneel, do something, do any sort of protest or talking about politics.
You don't see Chris Long getting the backlash that the rest of the guys get.
Right. I mean, there are examples, right? It may not be kneeling, but there are examples of white players who get involved with causes. J.J. Watt raised a ton of money, right, for a cause, and
but
nobody.
That was different.
It wasn't a political issue. But the point that I'm making is that when white athletes have made political points or have put their support behind certain issues, you don't see the level of discussion. And I'm totally aware that it's not apples to apples. But I just...
Yeah, I'll just add, so interesting enough, and this was a political issue. It wasn't a demonstrative protest, but Tim Tebow, he and his mother produced an advertisement that was pro-life. And the NFL, up until this particular television ad was produced, had a unwritten rule that they would not run political advertising during the Super Bowl. But that ad, backed by a very conservative organization, made it onto the Super Bowl. I am certain that there is a different mindset when it comes to a person of color making a protest than a person who's part of the majority. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I was just thinking of that one example.
Very good. I've been given the 60-second wrap-up, and that's gone very, very quickly.
Going.
It did go by very, very fast. On behalf of everyone here, we'd like to thank you guys so much for coming out. Kevin and Nancy and Kimberly, Atan and Keith, and we're delighted to have with us this evening David C. Hardesty Jr., who this Festival of Ideas has been carried on from his days here at WVU. It began back in 1966 in a special event here presented by the Reed College of Media here on the campus of West Virginia University. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We hope we've opened up some ideas and some thoughts. We thank our panelists for being with us, and thanks for being with us here this evening. Thank you.